We all think we know the story of Noah's Ark, right? The big flood, the giant boat, all the animals, two by two. But what if I told you that this famous biblical story wasn't the first of its kind? What if it's just one version of a much, much older story? Well, that's what we're going to dive into. So let me just ask you this straight up. What if the story you learned from Genesis actually has an older cousin, a predecessor that was written down centuries earlier in the cradle of civilization itself? Just thinking about that question, it really changes how you look at one of the most foundational stories in the world. And the answer is yes, it does. I want you to meet Utnapishtim. He's a hero from the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. Now, his story comes way before Noah's, but it has some, well, kind of startling similarities. And this isn't just some random coincidence. It's a huge clue that these ancient cultures might have been tapping into the very same deep, powerful memory. Okay, so let's start with the main characters. I mean, at the heart of any epic tale is its hero, right? And even though Noah and Utnapishtim both survived a world-ending flood, who they were, and more importantly, why they were chosen to survive, well, that's where the stories really start to diverge. So in one corner, we have Noah. The book of Genesis tells us he was a righteous man, someone who was chosen by God specifically to be saved from a flood that was all about divine judgment on a corrupt world. But then, in the other corner, you have Utnapishtim. He's a king, and the story doesn't say he's any more moral than the next guy. He just gets a secret tip in a dream from a friendly god named Ea, telling him how to escape a flood sent by other, really fickle gods. So right away, you see two heroes with two totally different reasons for being saved. Now, here's where it gets really wild. This isn't just about Noah versus Utnapishtim. Scholars have actually found over 230 different flood stories from cultures all over the planet. It's incredible. This whole thing points to a concept called cultural memory, this idea of a powerful, shared story of some kind of world-changing disaster that got passed down through generations. And of course, each culture put its own spin on it to fit their own unique worldview. All right, so from the heroes, let's talk about the vessels themselves. Because when you really look at the blueprints for these two arcs, they're not just boats, no way. They're actually these incredibly complex symbols that reflect the entire universe as their builders saw it. So just look at this breakdown. Noah's Ark is this long rectangular box, kind of like a modern cargo ship, really, with 3 decks. Utnapishtim's Ark, though, it's a perfect cube. A giant floating cube with 6 decks split into 7 levels. Even the materials are different, which makes sense, reflecting what was common in their parts of the world. But these aren't just little details. They're huge clues to a much, much deeper meaning. And this is where the cosmological theory comes in, and it's absolutely fascinating. A lot of scholars believe these arcs were designed as miniature models of the cosmos. So Noah's rectangular 3-story ark actually mirrors the proportions of the Solomonic Temple in Jerusalem, a holy place. Meanwhile, Utnapishtim's cubic 7-leveled ark is basically a floating Sumerian ziggurat, which they thought of as a cosmic mountain that connected heaven and earth. So you see, these weren't just lifeboats, they were floating temples designed to preserve cosmic order while the world outside fell into chaos. Okay, so we've got 2 floating temples, but why did they even need to be built? The reasons behind the flood, well, that reveals maybe the most profound difference between these two ancient stories. This is all about the why. In the Mesopotamian myths, the reason for the flood is honestly almost silly. The gods decide to wipe out all of humanity because people were being too loud and waking them up from their naps. Seriously, it's basically an act of divine annoyance. The Genesis story, on the other hand, gives us deeply moral reason. The world was filled with wickedness and violence. The flood wasn't just some rash decision, it was a painful, world-changing consequence of sin. And this really gets to the character of the divine in each story. The Mesopotamian gods act selfishly, and then they regret it later because, oops, there's no one left to make sacrifices for them. But in Genesis, we see a God who is heartbroken. As the theologian Richard Davidson points out, the text literally says God grieves. He feels the pain of humanity's choices. This is not some angry, petty deity. This is a creator who is suffering right alongside his creation. So all of this brings us to the big one. The central debate that has fascinated scholars for more than 100 years. Which story came first, and how in the world are they related? Was one just a copy of the other? Let's just frame the question directly, because there are really 2 major ways of looking at this. Was the Genesis story a Hebrew adaptation of a popular Mesopotamian myth that was already out there? Or Is it possible that both stories are just different echoes of a single real historical event, and that Genesis actually saved a more accurate version? The first piece of the puzzle is the timeline itself. You can see here that the earliest Mesopotamian flood stories we found, like the Atrahasis epic, go all the way back to around 1600 BC. The traditional date for Moses writing Genesis is about 200 years later, and the most famous version of Gilgamesh comes even later than that. So this order, Mesopotamia first, Genesis second, is the foundation for the first major theory. So the first view, which a lot of scholars hold, is that the Hebrew writers probably knew about these older, super popular Mesopotamian stories. I mean, they were everywhere. The argument goes that the writers of Genesis took the basic plot points, the hero, the boat, the animals, sending out the birds, and then totally reframed it. They turned a pagan myth about cranky gods into this powerful, monotheistic story about morality, judgment, and divine love. But then there's the second view, which argues the complete opposite. This theory suggests that a real, historical, global flood actually happened, and every culture just remembered it differently. In this view, the Mesopotamian stories are the corrupted, legendary versions of that true event. And the people who hold this view point out that Genesis is written like a history book. It's very sober, full of names, dates, and precise measurements, while the myths were always being changed for entertainment value. So they would argue Genesis isn't an adaptation, it's the preserved, accurate history. So we have this amazing academic debate raging on, but the power of these stories isn't just stuck in libraries. They are alive and well today, inspiring all sorts of new, creative, and sometimes pretty controversial ideas from people all over the world. For instance, think about the birds that Noah sends out from the ark. For most of us, they're just a way to figure out if the water has gone down. But for some modern readers, those birds hold a much deeper, hidden, symbolic meaning. I saw this really fascinating theory on Reddit. One user proposed that the sequence of the birds is actually a prophecy. They said the raven represents Judaism, the dove is Christianity, and a third bird is Islam. It's a really creative, modern way of looking at it, and it just goes to show how people are still digging for new meaning in these ancient texts. But, of course, that idea didn't just sit there. Someone else jumped in right away, quoting a line from the New Testament to argue against that kind of personal interpretation. And that simple online back and forth, it perfectly captures the tension that still exists today. Where do we find meaning? Is it through history, through tradition, or through new, personal readings? Clearly, the conversation is still very much alive. Which kind of leaves us with one final big question. After looking at all these layers, the heroes, the arcs, the gods, the origins, what is it really that gives a story like Noah's Ark its incredible, lasting power? Is it the chance that it's a true piece of history? Is it the profound moral message it carries? Or is it just the mystery of it all? The fact that thousands of years later, we're still telling it, still debating it, and still finding something new in the ancient story of a world washed clean.